Hey students, this week we're going to continue our series on hope. If you were with us last week, you know that we were looking at Romans chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, where we defined hope as putting our trust in something. And that gives us hope, especially when that thing that we're putting our trust in is God, based on his past promises to us, his present promises to us, and his future promises to us. And that verse ended with this idea of rejoicing. It says that we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Now, I've got a question for you before we get into the verse for today. What makes you rejoice? Like if you were to replay every moment in your life and pause on any moment where you rejoiced, where you were joyful, excited, just like freaking out with joy, what would those moments look like? My guess is for some of you, maybe it's things like you were at a basketball game and your team got a dunk and you just rejoiced. You gave high fives. Remember when we could give those? You just cheered. You went nuts. You were so excited. You were rejoicing. Or maybe if basketball is not your thing, you went to a concert. And when you were at that concert, you've been waiting for months to hear this band. And finally, the moment is here. You bought your tickets, you showed up, they come out on stage, and you rejoiced. You're about to have a fantastic experience and you were so excited. Or maybe it's something smaller. Maybe you rejoice when your mom or your dad calls you for dinner and you get to finally eat because you're so hungry. That causes rejoicing. But my guess is if you were to number everything in your life that's ever made you rejoice, somewhere in there would be an experience with God where he changed your life, where you heard a worship song that just brought tears to your eyes or made you lift your hands or you rejoiced. But if you went on down the list for all those, my guess, there's one word that would never make your list, and that's the idea of suffering. If we were to count all the times in our life that we've experienced joy, suffering would never make that list, would it? But what's really interesting is that smack dab in the middle of this passage about hope and about rejoicing is this idea of suffering. Romans chapter 5, verse 3 continues. It says, more than that, more than rejoicing because of the hope of the glory of God, we rejoice in our sufferings. And if it stopped there, if that was a period, this would be really confusing and would seem to be false, wouldn't it? Thankfully, it's a comma, and I'll explain it as we get into it. But just think about it. We do everything we can to avoid suffering. I know this is true, and you know this is true because you've had moments in your life where in a friendship or with somebody in your family, you've been frustrated. And rather than having the conversation that you knew you needed to have, you avoided them, right? I know you've done it. I've done it where we see our friend walking down the hallway at school and we know there's some awkwardness there and we just turn around and go the other way because we don't want to deal with it. Why? Because we want to avoid the pain and the suffering of having an awkward conversation. Or you procrastinate on your schoolwork. You don't study because studying's uncomfortable. You don't want to do it. You'd rather do something else. And so you put it off and you put it off. Why? Because you're trying to avoid discomfort. And sometimes it's way more serious than even those things. It's a family member who's sick. It's a struggle in your life that you can't seem to overcome. It's really difficult things that you would say it's not discomfort, it's not pain, it's actually suffering. And the idea of being joyful, of rejoicing in the middle of that seems so fake. Like there's no way you could actually rejoice in something that hurt really badly, right? And yet here in this scripture, it tells us that we can do that. And so I want to highlight just a few things as we go into it, again, with this idea of hope in mind, and ask God to teach us something so that we can apply it to our lives. So this thought, I said it ended with a comma. It continues with the rest of verse 3. It says, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And then in verse 4, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. There's that idea again. So here's what's awesome. This idea of suffering, the way that it produces hope is that we realize, and the way that we can rejoice in suffering is when we realize that pain leads to progress. When we submit our pain to the Lord, when we ask God to meet us in the middle of it, what happens is he begins to build endurance within us. And there's a knowledge that comes with this. We have the feeling of pain, and we don't ignore it. We don't belittle it. We don't pretend like it's not there. But as we're experiencing pain, we remember that God is faithful in the middle of it to build endurance within us. It'd be like this. If you went for a run today, some of you were like, nope, not unless somebody's chasing me. Never going to run. I get it. I understand. But pretend for a second that you decided to go for a run today, and you had not been running maybe ever or in many months, and you ran 1 mile. Now, that mile would probably be pretty painful, wouldn't it? You would be suffering. It's hot outside today, and it would not be pleasant for you to do that. But let's say you push through that, and a couple days later, you ran another mile. A couple days later, you ran another mile and another mile. Eventually, at some point, you would progress past that pain. You would build up strength. You would build up endurance where 1 mile would seem really easy. And you would begin to go 2 and then 3 and so on and so forth. Or it'd be like learning to play a guitar. The first time you play, some of you know this because you're musicians, your fingertips hurt, right? There aren't calluses there to protect against the strings. It hurts. But as you build up endurance, the calluses form and you begin to play easier and easier and longer without the pain. Well, it's the same when it comes to our suffering. That we see God in the middle of it meeting us and allowing us to build endurance. And endurance eventually produces character, and character eventually produces hope. This is how God meets us in the middle of our pain and our suffering. He is with us and he is for us. And here's what's great. As a reminder in this passage, that God doesn't allow any of our suffering to be wasted. Here's what I mean. There's a verse in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that teaches us more about this. It says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." Now, this verse, again, if you just take that one verse, it doesn't seem to be true sometimes, because we know that we've experienced things that don't feel good. In fact, you're living through some of that right now. With coronavirus, there is loss that you are experiencing. You're not able to leave your house right now. Some of you that are seniors or that are 8th graders, you're missing out on much of this semester that was your last chance to experience that year before moving on to the next stage of your life. You're not able to go and do the things you want to do. You've had school plays that have been canceled. You've had dances that have been canceled. You've had sporting events that have not happened. There is a sense of loss in the middle of this. And so this probably doesn't feel good. But here's the beauty, that in verse 29 and in verse 30 of this same passage, God defines what's good. He says, I'm going to summarize, but basically it says that we can be conformed to the image of Jesus through everything that happens in our lives. And that takes us back to Romans chapter 5, that we can rejoice in suffering when we remember that God is going to use it in our life to shape us, to be the people that he's calling us to be. So it is painful. It's no fun. It's things that we would like to avoid. And yet, in the middle of those moments where we feel like there's only loss, God causes gain. God causes progress. He brings healing and he brings hope right in the middle of it. And so my encouragement and my challenge for you is to recognize the fact that when you experience suffering, and you will, if you're not experiencing it right now, just log this message away for later, because eventually you will. When you experience it, God is there with you, and he's using it to shape you into the person he's creating you to be. And that may seem like a small prize, and it may seem like the price that you're paying of that suffering isn't worth it. But in the end, as you look back, you will get to see his faithfulness. You will get to experience his closeness in a way that you never would have apart from that suffering. So remember, when you experience suffering, it's not that God is causing it to happen. It's not that he's wanting you to be miserable, but in the middle of your pain, God is with you, and he's causing good to come out of it. This is the hope that we have in Jesus.